I have a confession. Indie sleaze never existed. It's just a figment of some people's imagination, or rather, it's revisionism. And in this conversation with Paul from Maxïmo Park, which I pronounced wrong quite early on in this episode, we get into what was really happening in music in 2005, the division between people who were art teachers making interesting, introspective rock music versus the lad rock, which seemed full of Oasis level of arrogance. And I guess you could say at the time there was a division between the kind of Blur and Pulp school of indie rock, the stuff that felt local and homegrown, and the things that felt like it already owned the world, even though they were still playing to 50 people and a dog. So what do we learn in this conversation? Well, it's 20 years since A Certain Trigger, Maxïmo Park's debut album, was released. It's a phenomenal record, and we got quite in the weeds with where the band started, how Paul started making music, some of the journey the band have been on since. We talk a bit about touring with the Arctic Monkeys alongside We Are Scientists and the Mystery Jets. We talk a lot about being music obsessives, because that's what happens when you pin two music obsessives down with a cup of coffee, put a camera and a mic in front of them and start nattering. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with one of British indie music's finest frontmen and one of the finest bands this country's ever produced. I'm Sean Adams. This is the Drown in Sound podcast. This is either the best first question or the worst. How objective can you be about A Certain Trigger 20 years on?
I like the reference. About as objective as I could be at the time. Although I'm being a bit facetious, I do have the capability of 20 years to add to that. But in some ways, you kind of you move on as soon as you make a record after you've toured it, especially onto the next one. And while you're touring it, you're thinking about the next one. And it's hard to be objective about something that you love as well. I mean, I think all of the records that we've made, especially being the person writing the lyrics, it's hard for me to be objective about any of them. They're all flawed. I think they're all good. You know, we put out our 8th record last year, and to me, it's as good as the first one. It's just different, but it still has the kind of DNA that we set into our music when we first started playing together. And I guess that's the sort of the idea of emotional connection through music, and the idea of the pop song being the central force behind what we're doing. Melody, chorus, verses, middle eights, the kind of traditional structures, but trying to bend them in your own particular way, and trying to balance, I guess, a lot of different elements, you know, balance all of the different hooks, the melodic hooks that we put into the songs with, again, trying not to be too much, just to be almost too much, but not quite. And similar with the lyrics, really, you know, a lot of the lyrics that I try and write are balances of complexity and simplicity. You know, again, my favorite pop songs, I suppose, have that balance. And for me, I've just obsessively listened to music all my life. I'm not a trained musician or anything. And when we first came to start making music together, I wasn't a singer or anything like that. So
yeah, you were in an instrumental band, weren't you, before you were?
Yes.
Which was quite surprising to reread. I was like, is that a mistake? I had to double check that someone hadn't written a back history. So what was the music you were making before Maxïmo Park sound like? Sorry, I have to emphasize the I, don't I? I realized.
You do, in a way. Everybody, including my parents, say Maximo, but I always thought, you know, I say Maximo, so the umlaut over the I is justified, even though it was a rock, you know, a rock reference. It actually has some sort of sonic reasoning behind it in the end.
I knew I was going to get it wrong. I was like, make a mental note, make sure I pronounce it right, because it's one of those words that you read and you're like, okay, I don't ever say that word out loud.
No. Well, this is it. I mean, the name itself is kind of still weird. I didn't come up with the name, and I always thought should we change this? And then we'd been going too long to change it, and it has its own mystique about it, even to me.
So what was the music like you were making before when you were an instrumental band? Was it like Tortoisey or something?
Yeah, I mean, Tortoisey without the chops. Myself and my friends Rachel and Laura, who are identical twins, Rachel and Laura Lancaster, who are now very successful artists, visual artists. We'd met at art college in Hartlepool, and we started making music together in a place called the Studio, just a really in a church, and it was, I don't know, £5 an hour, and they had some blown out Marshall amps in the corner and sticky carpets and bent microphones, and we used to just record ourselves playing, I guess, noise at that time. We were interested in, I guess we'd actually been on an art school trip. I'm digressing now, but we'd been on an art school trip.
Podcasts are designed for digressing.
Just as well. I am Mr. I did have a fanzine called I Digress that I did myself when the band was just starting out, as it happens. Because I'm known for my digressions amongst friends. And we'd been on an art school trip to London. First time I'd ever been to London when I was, 18. I'd just finished my A-levels and had gone to art college for a year to do a foundation course, and had met. Was
that around 2000 or so?
It must have been 2001. Oh, hang on, maybe 1999, because I remember the millennium happened once I eventually got to university. So it must have been about 98, 99, and we went down to London, and our photography teacher, Phil Rodriguez, had his own kind of noise and underground music label called Elsie, Jack and Phil, named after him and his parents, which he ran from a cliff top in Seaton, which is a very small seaside town near Billingham, where I grew up. And he was saying, you've got to go at this gig. It's at the Garage in London, upstairs at the Garage. And I'd read, being a sort of NME melody maker, Vox. Again, I liked a lot of different types of music. I used to read all the different magazines, and this is back in the day when you actually had to buy a record to hear it, or to go around to your mate's house to hear it. I'd seen upstairs at the Garage in the back of NME in the sort of live ads, and I would have gone anyway to a gig that night, but he said, this is the one, and it's Third Eye Foundation, this guy, Matt Elliott, and Hood. And so when we first went into recording just on mini disc and cassette tape in this studio, we were influenced by Sonic Youth and Hood, and I guess what you would call the post-rock scene, if you can call it that. And
it's interesting how often Hood come up. Like Steve from Blood Red Shoes was really into them as well. And I was Googling and saw that you guys toured together when I put one of their singles out.
Yes.
Like I feel like Hood get mentioned quite a lot because, like, for anyone that's not heard them, they sound a bit like Low, don't they? It's sort of, but with less of the kind of deep emotions that Low have.
Yeah, it's kind of fractured pastoral, I guess. And again, Low were another one of the bands. That idea of just being able to play slow songs. I think one of our songs was called Low Slow or something like that, and we had another one that was named after television because it sounded a bit like, well, again, like an amateur version of television. And so we put all of these different influences into just making music. Again, as a kind of art school person, that was my way of making music, and those were the things that my philosophy was to try and analyze and look at the world, but also to have this kind of visceral, spontaneous element to it. The idea of, as I was saying before, of balance between thinking about something but not overthinking it, but having that first thought, best thought still within the mix. And so when we first started as well, I remember Mogwai had put out their first album, and I'd never heard of Slint or any of the bands that obviously influenced Mogwai. And we went to see Mogwai at Middlesbrough Corner House, and Dave Parho's band Ariel M were supporting. And that basically became one of the sort of pivotal moments in my life, because I probably wouldn't be in a band necessarily without being influenced by that music. And then Maxïmo Park saw me dressed up in a suit, jumping up and down, because with our songs, because we weren't trained musicians, when we would go from one section to the next of these instrumental epics, I would kick in the air because everybody was looking down at the floor except for me. And we used to project Super 8 films behind us that we would just go on a journey on the metro up here in Newcastle, because we all ended up in Newcastle at university. And we had a song called Christina Ricci, which we used to have Christina Ricci in Buffalo 66 dancing in the background. We just, would rip the DVD and get it on. There was like a cinema called Side Cinema down on the quayside, which showed underground films. And there's a gallery there as well showing lots of different documentary photography. And so, yeah, we threw all of our different influences and kind of more of a mindset really into making music, which then led into Maxïmo Park a little bit. But again, with Maxïmo Park, I felt like when I joined, I didn't know what kind of lyrics to write or how to sing. So I tried to just be myself, and, I sang in my own accent, which again, I didn't realize that it was notable, except for when people started mentioning it. I was influenced again by people like Robert Wyatt, who, as a singer is so natural, and it feels like you just plugged into Robert Wyatt's soul and his sensibility. And whilst the music that Maxïmo Park make is very different to Robert Wyatt, again, I just wanted to sing honestly, truthfully, and, because the lyrics were quite heart on sleeve and still are, it allows me to just, I can be myself. And I think as time went on, I became more comfortable doing that. I listen back to a certain trigger now, and the singing isn't great, if you ask me, but it's truthful and it's honest, and it's where I was at that time. I was a naive
probably
guy.
Still learning how to breathe in the studio and all those things, aren't you?
Well, when we went into the studio with Paul Epworth, he was the first person to tell me how to do breathing exercises and warm up your vocals. And I was like, it only, my vocals only really get good sort of 3 or 4 songs in. What's that about, Paul? And he'd go, are you not warming up before you sing? And sure enough, the next day I'd be like unable to speak. The whole making that record with Paul was such an incredible experience. The more I think about it now, in 20 years later, how lucky we were to work with such a great person in the studio. We were like a team, which is what you want every time you make a record. You want everybody to be pulling in the same direction, and you want to learn from the people that you're working with all the time. And we were eventually in East Coast Studios, because we recorded The Night I Lost My Head and The Coast Is Always Changing, our first Warp single, in a place called 2 Kilohertz Studios in London.
Just that one.
Yeah, it was a small studio next to a graveyard, maybe in Kensal Rise. I'm going to say Kensal Rise, somewhere
right
near
near where Drowning Sound's office would have been at the time, actually.
There you go. Rock history was being made in print and on record. But yeah, I mean, I think you put us on at one of our early gigs, actually. There was a Drowning Sound gig
Yeah, I was trying to find it, Notting Hill Arts Club. And there's loads of references to it online, but I can't actually find the date in the lineup, because I was really curious who else played.
Well, I can't remember particularly anymore. I remember being in the rooms, and sometimes I don't know where the rooms are. And it's funny because you think that all of these things will be preserved by the internet, and then when you try and actually search something that's genuinely obscure, it's just not there a lot of the time, which is, maybe that's for the best with some of our early gigs. I'm not sure.
Well, I think if I remember right, there was a guy called Phil, I've forgotten his surname, who was in a band called S. Rock Levinson, who worked at Warp at the time. And you'd either just signed to Warp and they'd come to see you, or you were just about to. And we used to have this Saturday afternoon in Notting Hill Arts Club, which is a sort of basement venue just off of the main bit, opposite the Record and Tape Exchange, which people know quite well. Quite a lot of people have run club nights there. Alan McGee started his Death Disco night there. The club night that Lily Allen was really associated with when she came out was there. It was like quite a cool little space, but we had it from like 4 until 7 on a Saturday, which is an odd time to put on a gig. They were all free. And the amount of acts we put on that, like, we're like, do you fancy coming to London to play for us? And it was like, because I was curious whether you played the same night 65 Days of Static or one of the other, like,
that rings a bell.
or,
yes, 65 Days of Static, because I remember they were around and I was like, hey, we're on the same bill at that ring. Again, unless my memory is fabricating different things, because we played
that's my memory that you played with them, but I couldn't find it to double check it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Again, this may not be that interesting. was musing over this, but
yeah,
I think you're right.
This is about nostalgia, isn't it? In a way, because you are celebrating 20 years of the record. I wanted to ask a question which I think I know the answer to, but what was it like to sign to Warp? Because most people think of Warp and they think of Aphex Twin and Flying Lotus and all the amazing glitchy things that they do, but they did also have an imprint that put out some of Pulp's best songs, from what I vaguely just read then, which I didn't actually know. So what was it like to sign to a label like that? Because I'm assuming at the time there were quite a lot of people quite interested in you.
Yes, it was amazing, because we were just fans of the label, whether it's Ortekra or Aphex Twin. We were aware of Broadcast as well, another one of my favourite bands. I think everybody in the band,
too, yeah.
I think just Gravenhurst had just put out his first record maybe when we were recording, and I think when he came up to do an in-store, RPM Records, just sat on the counter with his acoustic guitar. I think he stayed at Tom's house, probably on the floor. And in the end, I mean, in 2010, when I put my first record out, Margins, Nick, who was Gravenhurst, ended up touring with me and being the first on. And I just have so many great memories of him as well as his music. And so, I was aware as a fan of Warp Records that it was, more than the sort of IDM or whatever you want to call it. But all that stuff, I remember going to a party and Square Pusher was there, and I was like, it's Square Pusher, and being definitely starstruck as somebody. I used to go to all tomorrow's parties, festivals, and travel all the way down from Newcastle to Camber Sands or Minehead, wherever it was, and to be part of that felt like, for us, very special, but also a bit of a marker as well to say, we're not your average sort of indie rock band. There's something else going on here. And again, not that, just because we signed to Warp, it didn't mean that everybody loved us. But it made people think twice about how to define the band. And I think for us, that was important because we were outsiders. And sure enough, you referenced the other people who were interested in signing us. And we invited Steve from Warp, Steve Beckett, who founded Warp. We invited him and a couple of other people who had sort of made, I guess, provisional offers of record contracts up to Newcastle, to the Cumberland Arms where we were playing. And I think I was the support act, if I remember rightly, with my friend Susie, and I think my friend Sarah played some melodica. And I mean, this was not the correct move if you want to sort of sign a big record contract. But I was doing like Brian Ferry and Smokey Robinson songs on a nylon string guitar or something, extremely quietly, again, more influenced by Low than anything else. And the afterwards, I did my thing. We maybe had somebody else on. Then Maxïmo Park played, and I'd like to think we were pretty good. And after the show, sweating, talking to these people, Steve Beckett was like, "Oh, that was an amazing show. I love that." And I remember one of the guys from one of the majors who was there was saying, it was a strange choice to start with Brian Ferry covers on an acoustic guitar. And I was like, was it? I don't know. I mean, I was just having a laugh and trying to do something good. But this is it. I think just going to go back to the first meeting that we ever had with Steve Beckett was in one of the London parks. We'd gone down, maybe we were doing a gig, and we met up with him, and he said, do you want to go somewhere, or should we just go at the park and just sit around? And we were like, that sounds good. It's a sunny day. Let's go. And I remember drinking some Snapple, which was popular at the time. again, I'm showing my age at every turn. But
Was Snapple was non-alcoholic, wasn't it? It was a bit like appetizer or something.
Yeah, it was like a sort of sweet juice, and in a glass bottle. Again, it felt posh. It was probably yeah.
So you went from there to selling 500,000 records, is what the internet believes. I don't know. Maybe it might be more, might be less. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Citation needed.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely went gold, because I remember getting a gold record that my mum and dad have got.
Is that 100,000, isn't it?
I think so, and that was fairly early on. So I reckon by now it's not for me. It's almost not for me to say, although it is my it's my bread and butter.
And then you headline the NME Awards tour. With support from the Arctic Monkeys, We Are Scientists, and Mystery Jets. How did that feel, going from drinking Snapple in a park to headlining Brixton Academy with 3 of the other most exciting bands in music at the time? What was that transitional kind of period like? Because it wasn't very long, was it, from what I can vaguely remember?
No, I mean, we signed our record contract on the Millennium Bridge up in Newcastle in 2004. In July or something. It was summertime. We made the record in autumn. It came out in May 2005, and I think the NME Tour was in maybe January, February 2006. So, and we'd been nominated for the Mercury Music Prize and been on Top of the Pops and Jules Holland and all those kind of things. And so it felt like something fairly momentous was happening all the time in terms of our own experience. And it culminated, I guess, in that NME tour, because as soon as that tour was finished, we went to try and write and then record the next album, Our Earthly Pleasures. And it felt like, I don't like, it's not victory lap or anything like that, because, music's not a competition. And I feel like, especially at the time, because there was a lot of bands around and there was only so many Top of the Pops places, things were quite competitive, and I didn't like it, and it felt very odd. But it did feel like, okay, we're headlining this big tour. It's been sold out for a while. People have bought the tickets, and now you've got, the Arctic Monkeys had put out their first record, and it was, I think, the biggest debut album of all time at that point, while we were in the middle of the tour. But yeah, for us, we were just excited to have made this record that people loved, and every night of the tour, just watching people in the audience who'd probably seen us on a tour the previous year, or had been to lots of the little gigs and had seen the audiences and the venues grow. It felt, somehow a kind of a nice way to finish that round of touring, and to sort of put an exclamation point on it. To be part of something, a sort of package tour is, again, it's quite unusual. It feels, I don't know whether there's that much of that kind of thing that goes on these days, but it was a way of...
Yeah, I don't think the NME stopped doing them a little while ago. I think around the same time they stopped being in print, and it felt like something quite seismic every time those tours rolled around, because they were always... like most of the act, like 2 of the acts could probably have sold out the venues themselves, and then the other, like I saw some, like the first time I saw Coldplay was on one of those tours.
Yes, me too.
To almost no one, and
with Shaq,
Shaq
and Le Rhythm Digital, I think.
Yeah,
it was. I mean, again, that was a pretty weird lineup as well, and Campak Velocet maybe.
That was a. I definitely saw. I saw them with Terrace as well, and I think that was like maybe a different NME tour or something.
Oh yeah, no, I remember.
But I did.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember that one advertised as well. Again, I'm remembering all of my old enemies that are in the loft.
The soundproofing.
Yeah.
So that must have been quite a heady time, and I'm sure you've talked about being on Top of the Pops a lot and how surreal that must have been. And am I right that Jeremy Clarkson was the person that was introducing you? Because I was listening to the Rise and Fall of Indie Sleaze podcast, and Jeremy Clarkson makes some like snide comment after you come off stage.
I had no idea. This is the thing. It's all a bit of a blur. I don't remember him being on at all. But if you tell me that, then that must be
maybe
be
I mislistened to the podcast. I'll go back and triple check. But that was such a rich time for music, and people are now shoving this name indie sleaze on it, which to me is the most confusing name, because it's throwing a lot of music together that didn't really sit together. And whilst I understand the need for people to try and box it into something and not just call it indie, because so many of the bands were signed to major labels, it doesn't make sense to call it that either. I had a theory that there was sort of lit rock and lad rock, and there were like two, it was almost Blur and Oasis division between the different types of acts. And I always felt like you sat much closer to like the Long Blondes and artists that really came from this like rich cultural heritage, and that were doing something which felt, and like in a weird way, both the Libertines and the Arctic Monkeys sort of sat in the middle, and they didn't know which of those types of bands they were. How did you reflect on it being part of a kind of movement at the time? Like, I think I read somewhere where you said you didn't really like being sort of an NME guitar band, because that felt like it eventually became what people called landfill indie, didn't it? And so what are your sort of reflections on that time, and does the name indie sleaze feel at all relevant to you?
Not really. I think, being sleazy is not particularly something to be proud of.
No.
And I'd like to think our band were the kind of antithesis of that. We had songs called Postcard of a Painting, rather than, I guess, the more laddie approach that a lot of other bands had. And, there was a lot of leather jackets around, and rock and roll behavior. And we were young people being idiots as well. I'm not saying we weren't, but our interests were laying elsewhere, and it was difficult to be sort of part of something that you don't feel part of. I mean, the fact is, if all of these other bands hadn't been successful, we probably wouldn't have got on Top of the Pops either. I've still no idea why we were grouped in with it in some ways, but in other ways I understand, because we were unashamedly talking about pop music, and we wanted, our choruses were and still are very occasionally quite big. That's part of our interest in and something that we can't really stop. We can't deny it. And again, that's where you get a kind of crossover. And then, sometimes I think, well, even if we hadn't have had that, we'd still be playing these songs in the Head of Steam in Newcastle. And, one of my favorite bands is like the Go-Betweens, and that idea of trying to create songs to connect with people that are crafted, and it's not a very cool or rock and roll thing to talk about. So again, I understand why that side of the band is either ignored or just not even considered. It's not really, people wouldn't necessarily think about it. They just go, hey, it's music from that time. And I think that's difficult as somebody who's trying to make music and think of it in terms of art. I believe that a pop song is one of the most amazing art forms. It just happens to be quite disposable, accessible. And again, that's one of the reasons why it's disparaged, because, a working class person from a suburb in Billingham can be on Top of the Pops in a suit, being, trying to put on a performance, and people find that hard to deal with somewhere along the line. And I think, for us, the word, there was like the magazine Art Rocker was out at the time, and we always felt much more of a kinship with that art rock ideal. And I think the kind of sleazy, the word sleaze has been definitely added to it, because there was a certain, I don't know, a kind of lascivious nature to certain bands, or to, our songs deal with, sex and desire as much as they deal with rejection and
coastal
loneliness.
erosion.
Yeah. Yeah. Massive coastal erosion metaphors. That's not a metaphor. But it's again, the more that you try and define yourself, the more you explain too much. I think.
Yeah.
I like an element of mystique. I am just a very ordinary person, which is why I dress up and try and, perform and be something different on stage, a sort of enhancement of what I am as I walk down the street, or if I'm, with my family. I want our songs to be extraordinary, but I'm very ordinary, and they're born out of ordinary everyday life, and a belief that that's a valid topic for a pop song. How can we transform our mundane lives into something special? They are special, in my opinion, and that's always been our part of our mantra as a band, is to have that within the songs. And so, again, our influences are from art, from literature, photography, cinema, whatever. Life is inspiring, and to have things boiled down to a word that doesn't bear much relation to what you feel you're doing. I mean, that's in some ways difficult. In other ways, it's human nature. It's how we describe things. It's a necessary evil. But I think, there's so much music that was. I mean, it would be like putting a bracket around what's happening now. There's always great music being made. Sometimes it's commercially viable for whatever reason. The gatekeepers allow it in, which is certainly the case with ourselves. As I say, it feels anomalous that we, had a top 10 single with a song called Our Velocity, which is a, fairly unusual song. It's quite abrasive, as a lot of our songs are. I think, again, that sort of edge, again, I think that's something that the word sleaze is trying to perhaps fill in for, well, there's something edgy about this. And unfortunately, there was a lot of probably edgy behavior from, foolish people at the time, which ends up, again, being filtered into the kind of music that was being made, and it becomes kind of meaningless. But there you are.
Yeah, I think that knowing lots of the artists that have been thrown into, like, I released Metric, and one of their remix of Monster Hospital and Mastercraft is being put on this like greatest indie sleaze songs playlist. I'm like there might have been people being sleazy towards the band, but the music itself is political. It's they took lots of references from bands like The Clash in terms of where their purpose as a band was, and then I think back to all of the Mystery Jets. There was nothing sleazy about the Mystery Jets. You've got, and I don't know, even the AAYers, there was an energy to what they were doing that actually felt quite counter to a kind of male dominated space. And I think that the revisionist way of talking about a genre which was defined by a lot of men that were very successful, that weren't necessarily the epitome of a scene, because often you look at the 70s New York scene and it's Patti Smith and you've got centerpieces to all these different scenes where not necessarily the big names that with grunge, it's Soundgarden and Pearl Jam might be the big successful artists, but when you dig in, there were a lot of bands like Mudhoney and people who would have defined it in a very different way, and you sort of need that core. I've found that I actually found the podcast Kate Nash hosted really good. I thought it was a really nice kind of reflection back on a moment in time, but living through it, going to White Heat, where I think I must have seen you play.
Yes.
And going to and I went to that club night pretty much every night for about 3 or 4 years. It was every Wednesday, I think, if I remember off the top of my head, because that was the night students got a half day. And Adele wrote a song after going there, and all these different people were part of this very small kind of scene of Yanis from Foals, his previous project, the Edmonds Fitzgerald, which was an instrumental kind of post-rocky band, they were part of that small scene. And then when they played their first Foals show, there was hardly anyone there. And I don't know, I find the revisionism interesting, that people feel that they want to try and make sense of that moment in time. And I think Apply Some Pressure has such a, it's to think that we started this conversation talking about you being into sort of slowcore bands. That song has such a pace to it, and I don't know whether there's something in the BPM of the song which kind of almost defies that moment in time as well. That's, I don't know how you get all those words in. I guess was a band like the Manics or someone an influence on a track like that to kind of ricochet through songs like you're a kind of machine gun?
Not consciously, but I do remember actually, probably subconsciously, listen to the Holy Bible record and reading the lyrics, because my brother had it on CD, my younger brother, and you're not allowed to like the same music as your younger brother. So I'd kind of nick some of his CDs from time to time. And that was like songs like PCP, the really sort of thrashy ones with loads of lyrics in. I mean, yeah, I definitely, I love words. And again, the idea of people being seen potentially as pretentious is not, again, it's more of a, let's have a look, let's check out if it actually is pretentious, which is a fairly unusual word to define when you actually come to it.
I've still never fully figured out what pretentious means.
No, it's kind of like woke. Like, what does that actually mean? Anyway, that's another conversation.
It means awake to injustice.
Exactly. That's it's as simple as that.
So if you're not that means you're asleep to injustice, and that you're quite happy for injustices to carry on. So why is it a bad thing?
Exactly. And it's as easy as that in the end. I think, to have pretensions towards something else other than the ordinary is no bad thing whatsoever. And I used to get abuse for reading from a book on stage and having that as part of the performance for only one song. But again, the photographs would be of me with a book at a gig, and that was useful. Again, it marked us out from some of the other bands that were around and laid the foundations for people to understand the band a bit better. But on the other hand, if it winds people up, then there might be something wrong with them anyway, or our music. They probably wouldn't like our music anyway.
Can I just check? You weren't reading Bukowski. This might be where the whole indie sleaze things come from.
I was not. I was reading F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gwendolyn Riley. But that's again, it's F. Scott Fitzgerald is a good example of another thing that I think of when I think of our music, and especially at that time, how to define ourselves was romantic. What are we doing here if romance isn't dead? Is a line from Graffiti, and I feel like that's a defining line for the band at that time, to say we are the new romantics. It's not just about post-punk. Again, a lot of people at the time said post-punk revivalists, whereas we loved definitely the Raincoats or Gang of Four or whatever, the Slits, but we also liked Can and Noi. I think that if you listen to our music, the rhythms are often like Noi speeded up, which again, it was just because that's what the rhythm section was digging, and the Fall, another big influence. But you don't want to be another Fall. You don't want to be, you've got to find the thing that is unique to yourself. So again, to me, it was making the everyday romantic, and that is, again, it stems from things like The Tragedy of Anna Karenina, which was like my favorite book at the time, and Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald, but also Arthur Russell, like Nick Drake. I was listening to a lot of folk music, and again, I was trying to sort of get some softness, I suppose, as a contrast to the edge. And the edge of our music needs to be there, but also that sensitivity and a softness, a traditional femininity, if you like. Again, it was something that I wanted our band to be inclusive to as many people as possible, and I tried not to use too many pronouns in the songs, even though some of them are there and are necessary for those songs. That was something that I didn't want them to be just tied to my experience or my life as somebody writing the lyrics. I wanted them to be open to everybody. There were lyrics like "Everyone should have a choice" in "Kiss You Better" from the record, a kind of subliminal political messages, just the way that you hold yourself or the way that you express yourself in song, and when people approach you. Again, at the time, people wanted kind of rock and roll behavior and ludicrous quotes, and we didn't really give them any of those things. I remember reading...
you were talking about Anthony Gormley in an interview that I was reading earlier from the Time.
Blimey, this is it. You've done your research.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was... Yeah, it's... Again, I don't want to feel like, hey, I'm justifying myself as the kind of sensitive guy out of this scene or whatever. But we came from a very isolated place. You know, the Northeast as a region is economically deprived. It's, you know, culture is often from other places. And we wanted to define the place that we came from within the songs and within our behavior. You know, we support the local scene. You know, we wanted more equality on bills. So we had Blood Red Shoes or, you know, the Long Blondes played with us, or Electra Lane, you know, asking Electra Lane to support us, and them saying yes was mind blowing to me, you know. So yeah, to me, there was, like my favorite, I think one of the things that we all loved in our band was Any Other City by Life Without Buildings. That was
one of my favorite albums.
I think that's my favorite record ultimately, if I had to say one. And just that idea of having this propulsive music that's made with drums, bass, guitar, and vocals, and it still sounds radical. You know, I'm not saying that Maxïmo Park sound particularly radical, but that you know, our ambitions extend outside of the meat and potatoes of indie rock. Even though I love what I would term indie rock, Sebado or whatever. You know, to me, that was the sort of template really in terms of, can we write songs that are interesting, that are emotionally bare and joyful? You know, like music is joyful to me, and even sometimes, you know, wallowing in Avalanche by Leonard Cohen brings me a lot of pleasure. You know, listening to The Hissing of Summer Lawns by Joni Mitchell continues to be a sort of transcendent experience for me. And so, yeah, to me, or Vespertine by Björk or something like that. It's just, I love music, and whatever kind of music we make, I want it to have that joy in it. I want people to enjoy it and love it, and I want to love making it. And all of those things went into that first record and still do. You know, that's what I wanted to do. We went to Atlanta last year to record our last album, and then we put it out in the autumn, and I just was like, yeah, this, I stand by this.
Just
you know?
just in case anyone wants a headline, you mean your previous album, not your final album, right?
You never know. I see them all as final albums.
Okay.
I see that. I mean, the last song, No Such Thing as a Society, on our last album could be the sort of perfect epitaph for the band, and that's good. You know, like, why put records out if you don't care about them, or if you cruising along? You know, we had a song called Questing Not Coasting from our third record, and that's basically, yeah, my manifesto. You know, I don't want to coast along, even though that's quite nice from time to time. I want to be outside of my comfort zone, whether it's making records with Rachel Unthank or Peter Brewis from Field Music, or making music with the band. I want it to feel exciting, but I also think they could all be the last one. I don't know if I'm going to have anything that is relevant to anybody else's life by the next record. You have to be honest with yourself, and our songs have kind of catalogued all the different stages of life, and sure enough, it's through my lyrical prism most of the time. But you know, they're reflective of. I mean, we only have so many emotions. A lot of the songs on the last album are wondering where we are as a society, or where I am as a parent, or you don't have to be a parent to enjoy a song that comes from that experience. But it's my job as part of the band, and it's our job collectively to filter through the things that are personal, so that they become universal, but not in that kind of anthemic, everybody get your hands in the air kind of anthemic universality.
Hi there, it's Emma here. I'm gatecrashing the podcast to quickly tell you about the Drowned in Sound newsletter. every Wednesday, I invite myself into your inbox, with permission, of course, to share opinion writing and resources, tell you about cool things that you should be involved in within the world of music, activism, etc. I also bring track of the week and a little bit of hopeful news for you, because we all know that the news cycle can be grim at the best of times. Drowned in Sound newsletter every Wednesday in your inbox. Sign up now.
There's about 10 follow-up questions from all of that. But there's one thing you talk about, maybe that being your last statement. Your opening statement to your debut album is the drums wandering in really slowly, like a fade in of drums is quite rare. And then the first line to the record is, well, I've been waiting here for hours. How important did the opening to your debut album feel, and how is that the bit that was laboured over, or was that the bit you knew exactly what it was going to be?
We knew. Once it's time to sort of get to that track listing stage, it was obvious. And it was the same with the second record. Starts with, you've been with me a year to the day, 365 days watching me decay. And that felt like the great opening line to that album, you know, and all of the themes that were on that record, and so on and so forth. And we had been waiting. It felt like we'd been waiting for the world to hear what we had to say. And it felt like, again, you're supposed to come in with, especially these days in the kind of streaming world, you have to make an impact within those first 12 seconds or whatever the algorithm says. And it was saying, here it comes, you know, what is your record player actually on? You know, and we wanted people to turn it up really loud and then be blasted by the opening guitar riff when it came in. But it's that idea of I mean, there's a lot of waiting in our songs. There's a lot of waiting in the rain, and that ennui of life. It's part of everybody. There's a loneliness at our core. You know, a lot of our songs are about trying to come to terms with that, or reckon with the fact that we're all trapped inside these bodies that we're sometimes very uncomfortable with. We have our own thoughts that we cannot tell what is in somebody else's mind. And that to me is a kind of endless source of fascination. Yet we try and communicate. We have language. We have many different ways to communicate. And yeah, that idea of I mean, the whole song is a kind of linguistic, they're kind of made into slogans, but they're kind of linguistic telltale signs, you know, the signal and sign idea. And that idea of there being a dialectical thing going on between yourself and the audience, you know, it's all in there, but it's just a song, and it should hit you on that very basic level. But if you listen to it again and again, you might go, well, what's that about? Or on a different day, a certain line will strike you in a different way. But I mean, I was waiting for my life to start. In many ways, you know, I was working as an art teacher, working part-time on Teesside, living in Newcastle, and staying at my parents' house again, you know, in my early 20s. And I'm like, how did life get to this? You know,
interestingly, I think Ricky from the Kaiser Chiefs was in exactly the same position when I put Oh My God out. They couldn't play shows on Tuesdays because he was lecturing in art. And I wonder how many art teachers we lost to that music scene. Maybe that was what the better name for it would have been, the art teachers indie or something.
This is it. I feel like it's born out of that idea of and a lot of art comes out of waiting around and being bored, which in our current hyper mobile there's a kind of hyper mobility about the dissemination of media now, that it's hard to be bored. If you've got a phone in your pocket and you can afford the data, there's always something else to look at. I remember being in a waiting room where it said position closed, and just thinking, I'll write that down in my notebook. And there it was as the first and second lines on the record.
In one of your answers a second ago, you talked about slogans, and I found it quite interesting how clearly political your music is, but possibly with a small p some of the time. And as a fellow working class person wandering into kind of a corporate world of music, it struck me that reading a bunch of interviews with you that hardly any of probably quite well-off journalists, because I've met a lot of journalists and I've met a lot of music journalists, and the class element of questioning power, of kind of planting seeds in other people's brains to question their realities. Like, do you feel that there wasn't really the landscape to have those conversations and people were more interested in the kind of surreal rather than, like, as I think you said in one interview, you wanted not to escape reality but to enhance it, and I guess in some ways bring some things into more focus? Do you feel like the politics of your music, or do you feel like that's something you've had to sort of hide or just not had the opportunity to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it was never really something that was on the agenda for people to talk about. It felt focused on other things. I mean, you know, the idea of something being called the Rock and Roll Riot Tour, and, you know, less than riotous and rock and roll bands. Again, I felt like we were always and still are anti-cliche, really. And sometimes you can embrace a cliche when it's the time to do so and to throw another spanner in the works. But yeah, to me, we have made more overtly political records and songs. And I think they help to kind of define who you are as a band. And once you've made a record, like we made the record Risk to Exist, which was very, it was more slogans. It was kind of like, can we write interesting slogans? Is this, can we fit them into a song without it becoming overweighted by these things? And sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. But we made that conscious effort to do that. And I think once you've made that record, you can then make another record and people see some of the things that are small p political, and feel them and recognize them because you've already made that statement. And it would work better for a band that was really successful, you know, like who were selling millions of records. That would define them in people's eyes in a different way. But, you know, we can't control that. We have to make decisions within our own sort of ecosystem, our own little world. And I feel like making that record almost kind of clears the decks and allows you to infer political things into the other records that perhaps weren't as clear at the time. And I remember, you know, the second record came out and it was like, what is my place in the world? You know, as a young person enthralled to our earthly pleasures, you know, I'm here living my life, but I'm also concerned about the bigger context. How does that work? You know, who am I? What is happening? And some of the songs like The Unshockable from that record, or Sandblasted and Set Free, were kind of, I suppose, in a loose sense, ecologically minded. And I remember at the time, one of the reviews was saying, "Come on, Paul, the kids don't want to hear about that ecological stuff," which, you know, hasn't aged well. Maybe the songs haven't aged well. That's, again, a side issue.
I think the reluctance for anybody to really consider the crisis that the planet faces, like even The Guardian puts up news stories, but like they put up one yesterday with this big exclusive ahead of COP on how we've gone way beyond 1.5 degrees, and it wasn't on the homepage like 6 hours later, and it was like you put a breaking news alert out at midnight, and they did another one last night I noticed, and it's the inconvenient truth for a lot of the media is that the people that fund it, the people that run adverts in it, like The Guardian's reliant on adverts from British Airways and places to cover its print costs and things like that. It's like, well, no, they're not reliant on it. But you start to just look at the kind of power structures we've got. Like Rolling Stone is owned by Penske Media. That's the same guy that parked his Formula One team on Trump's lawn. And it's like, there's the same people that run South by Southwest and have the military come and run adverts. And I think that when I first got into music, we were doing tours with Love Music, Hate Racism, and there were like a few elements of the industry that were sort of political but not. And I don't know, it feels like politics has come so much into music now that it would be hard for anyone making political music for it not to fly or for it to fly under the radar, I guess. One of the things that I thought was kind of notable about the sort of time when a certain trigger came out was a sense of identity in a kind of rapidly globalizing world. Like MTV had really kind of put all those kind of new metal bands into the center of things. Plus we'd had the Strokes and the Datsuns and all these very American kind of rock bands. I think I read that you said it wasn't conscious, and I think you even said earlier in the interview it wasn't conscious to use your accent, but it was notable how many of the people that did come out at that time spoke like where they were from. And I think that, I mean, I grew up in the West Country, and probably the only voice I hear that sounds at all from the West Country is Tricky or someone. It's not exactly a accent that people want to use. I think there's the Wurzels, but it was notable that a sense of identity, and I think that I was just curious how we're kind of reflecting back on the record. You're kind of glad that you were defiant in who you were and where you were from. Was that something that you think about reflecting back on it now?
Yeah, I mean, there's no other way, I guess. We especially myself, because I wasn't a member of the band, I spent so long thinking, what should I be doing? You know, and I wrote so many different types of lyrics, more political ones that just, you know, didn't feel right. You know, they felt too sloganeering. And so I think that first record is a sort of reflection of the self, and, you know, trying to find ways of integrating myself into the band as well, because some of the lyrics were already there in certain songs, like Limassol or Graffiti have a lot of the original lyrics there that Duncan and Archers had written. And I was like, well, you know, I need to sing these with conviction, so I need to understand what they're about. And so I would, you know, take a verse out, add my own verse. You know, what does the word Limassol mean? It sounds really good. Let's write around that. You know, like that.
What does it actually mean? I meant to look that up.
Well, this is it. Limassol, as a place, I felt like, okay, I've never been to Limassol. Neither had Archers, who had written the song. But I was thinking about the idea of escape escaping from a small town, for one thing, to Newcastle, where I ended up at university. But also the idea of, when I was growing up, I didn't understand why people went on foreign holidays. I was like, I'd never been out of the country till I was 21, I think. I was eventually, when this song was proposed to me, I was like, well, I can understand that now, that idea of escaping even further. We're going to head for new horizons, Limassol. And so, yeah, I kind of put that lyric in to justify the yelp of Limassol, which sounded to me so unusual. And I was like, we've got to keep that bit in. And so, yeah, a lot of the early songs, I was trying to find a way of being myself and making sure that I was myself, and that none of, you know, I wanted to, as I say, the conviction to be there. And so, yeah, I feel like I feel there was a kind of defiance that still remains within me to this day. You know, I'm in this. There's the song "Our Velocity" off the second record says, if everyone became this sensitive, perhaps I wouldn't have to be so sensitive, or something like that. And it's true. You know, I feel like I'm all built to be the lyricist or whatever. Because I am quite a sensitive person, and I'm sensitive to things and empathetic, but also that means that you are, when people start to talk to you about your music or criticize your music or who you are or what you look like, that's also very difficult to deal with. And people can be obviously very precious about things. And so as a young person at the time, I mean, I say young person, we were a little bit older than like teenage bands. We'd been in our teenage bands, and we're still in them. You know, I was still playing with Me and the Twins, playing instrumental music when I came back off tour from Maxïmo Park, and that was just, yeah, I didn't have a choice. I felt like, in terms of who I was and how to be, It was just trying to figure out a way of presenting it to other people, and having that everydayness in it, as well as a bit of showbiz. You know, when I was growing up, you know, David Byrne was a good example to me of a front person. I always say Iggy Pop, David Byrne, and Brian Ferry were sort of like, what would a kind of amalgamation of these people look like a little bit if they came from Billingham rather than anywhere else. But also I remember seeing like PJ Harvey. I think we'd just signed our record deal. I'm not sure if we'd made the record. I don't think we had. And I went to see her. We all went to Tea in the Park as a band. And I was floored, you know, absolutely. I loved PJ Harvey, but I'd never seen her perform live. And it was I think Her had just come out.
Yeah, I was going to say I was about that around that time, wasn't it?
And, you know, she was wearing the sort of Spice Girls cut off dresses and just was really going for it, you know, not always playing the guitar, sometimes just prowling the stage. And I was like, that's it. That's the thing. And I'm seeing it. You know, many other people have the thing, and you want the thing. If you're the front person, and I felt like that was a role for our songs, you know, other people, I don't know. I'm a big Elliott Smith fan, you know. Elliott Smith's not going to be jumping around the stage or even thinking about how he presents himself. That's not the way it is. But with our band, it was like, right, these are pop songs. They're alternative pop.
You are making me wonder if you've done your research on me, because I think you've mentioned 4 of my favourite records in this interview, or artists. Elliott Smith being one of the absolute favourites. What a thoroughly lovely man. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Paul, I've met a few times over the years, but probably not for a very long time. Probably over 10 years. And I don't know if we've ever had like a one-to-one. I think we've always just met in like noisy gigs and festivals and things for like 30 seconds. I did fact check one thing. Jeremy Clarkson definitely was the person on Top of the Pops when they were on, which is interesting. It was a very weird comment that he made. Maybe we could drop the clip in, and if we can find it. I know it was on the Rise and Fall of Indie Sleaze podcast, the clip, and I didn't think I imagined it. The special edition, the 20th anniversary edition of A Certain Trigger, is out now, and it comes with loads of extra B-sides and demos. It's a proper fans collector edition of an album that celebrates 20 years, and what a great record it is. I hope that if you enjoyed this episode, and if you weren't that into Maxïmo Park, you might delve into their catalogue a little bit. I'd really recommend Paul Smith and Rachel Unthank's record. It's a record I hadn't really spent much time with. It came out during COVID and it passed me by, and I listened to it researching this podcast. I thought it was fantastic. Really gentle, beautiful, kind of like classic British folk music or English folk music. I guess there's not much else to say about that episode. I really enjoyed revisiting the record. It was an album I listened to a lot wandering around London in my headphones. When it came out, I always was a fan of watching the band live, and I should get myself along to their tour next year, and you can do that too. If you go to the Maxïmo Park website, you can find all the tour dates, including a massive show at London's Brixton Academy. They will be across the country, and let's hope it's not the last record, because I picked up on the word last, and I only because people say, oh, our last record, as in the one we just released. But yeah, that was a little surprise, wasn't it? I think I'm going to leave it there, because this was a long interview, and based on YouTube stats, there's probably not that many of you left watching, and if you are, please drop a comment and say hi. It's always nice to hear from you all and to know that you're out there and that you're enjoying what we're doing. I have been Sean Adams. This has been the Drown in Sound podcast. Thank you to Josh, our producer, for editing this together so I didn't have to sit and listen to myself for an hour or two. And if you follow Drown in Sound on Instagram and our YouTube shorts and all those kind of places, there's an extra little clip we recorded with Paul about a record from the last 25 years that he thinks more people need to hear. And if you were paying close attention during the episode, you might be able to guess which artist that might be by. So, bye for now. I've been me. You've been you. This is the Drown in Sound podcast. Goodbye.